Gerald asked. "Quite sure," said Gudrun. "I wouldn't be so mean as to take it if there was the slightest doubt. But I've had a canoe at Arundel, and I assure you I'm perfectly safe." So saying, having given her word like a man, she and Ursula entered the frail craft and pushed gently off. The two men stood watching them. Gudrun was paddling. She knew the men were watching her, and it made her slow and rather clumsy. The color flew in her face like a flag. "Thanks awfully," she called back to him from the water as the boat slid away. "It's lovely, like sitting in a leaf." He laughed at the fancy. Her voice was shrill and strange, calling from the distance. He watched her as she paddled away. There was something childlike about her, trustful and deferential, like a child. He watched her all the while as she rowed. And to Gudrun it was a real delight, in make-believe, to be the childlike, clinging woman to the man who stood there on the quay, so good-looking and efficient in his white clothes, and moreover the most important man she knew at the moment. She did not take any notice of the wavering, indistinct Lambent Birkin, who stood at his side. One figure at a time occupied the field of her attention. The boat rustled lightly along the water. They passed the bathers whose striped tents stood between the willows of the meadow's edge, and drew along the open shore, past the meadows that sloped golden in the light of the already late afternoon. Other boats were stealing under the wooded shore opposite. They could hear people's laughter and voices. But Gudrun rowed on towards the clump of trees that balanced perfect in the distance, in the golden light. The sisters found a little place where a tiny stream flowed into the lake, with reeds and flowery marsh of pink willow herb and a gravelly bank to the side. Here they ran delicately ashore with their frail boat. The two girls took off their shoes and stockings and went through the water's edge to the grass. The tiny ripples of the lake were warm and clear. They lifted their boat onto the bank and looked round with joy. They were quite alone in a forsaken little stream mouth, and on the knoll just behind was the clump of trees. "We will bathe just for a moment," said Ursula, "and then we'll have tea." They looked round. Nobody could notice them, or could come up in time to see them. In less than a minute, Ursula had thrown off her clothes and had slipped naked into the water and was swimming out. Quickly, Gudrun joined her. They swam silently and blissfully for a few minutes, circling round their little stream mouth. Then they slipped ashore and ran into the grove again, like nymphs. "How lovely it is to be free," said Ursula, running swiftly here and there between the tree trunks, quite naked, her hair blowing loose. The grove was of beech trees, big and splendid, a steel-gray scaffolding of trunks and boughs, with level sprays of strong green here and there, whilst through the northern side the distance glimmered open as through a window. When they had run and danced themselves dry, the girls quickly dressed and sat down to the fragrant tea. They sat on the northern side of the grove, in the yellow sunshine facing the slope of the grassy hill, alone in a little wild world of their own. The tea was hot and aromatic. There were delicious little sandwiches of cucumber and of caviar, and winey cakes. "Are you happy, Prune?" cried Ursula in delight, looking at her sister. "Ursula, I'm perfectly happy," replied Gudrun gravely, looking at the westering sun. "So am I." When they were together, doing the things they enjoyed, the two sisters were quite complete in a perfect world of their own. And this was one of the perfect moments of freedom and delight, such as children alone know, when all seems a perfect and blissful adventure. When they had finished tea, the two girls sat on, silent and serene. Then Ursula, who had a beautiful, strong voice, began to sing to herself softly, "Ancient von Thurau." Gudrun listened as she sat beneath the trees, and the yearning came into her heart. Ursula seemed so peaceful and sufficient unto herself, sitting there unconsciously crooning her song, strong and unquestioned at the center of her own universe. And Gudrun felt herself outside. Always this desolating, agonized feeling that she was outside of life, an onlooker, whilst Ursula was a partaker, caused Gudrun to suffer from a sense of her own negation and made her that she must always demand the other to be aware of her, to be in connection with her. "Do you mind if I do Dalcroze to that tune, Hurtle?" she asked in a curious muted tone, scarce moving her lips. "What did you say?" asked Ursula, looking up in peaceful surprise. Will you sing while I do Dalcroze? Said Gudrun, suffering at having to repeat herself. Ursula thought a moment, gathering her straying wits together. While you do, she asked vaguely. Dalcroze movements, said Gudrun, suffering tortures of self-consciousness, even because of her sister. Oh, Dalcroze. I couldn't catch the name. Do, I should love to see you, cried Ursula with childish surprised brightness. What shall I sing? Sing anything you like, and I'll take the rhythm from it. But Ursula could not for her life think of anything to sing. However, she suddenly began, in a laughing, teasing voice. My love is a highborn lady. Gudrun, looking as if some invisible chain weighed on her hands and feet, began slowly to dance in the eurythmic manner, pulsing and fluttering rhythmically with her feet, making slower, regular gestures with her hands and arms, now spreading her arms wide, now raising them above her head, now flinging them softly apart, and lifting her face, her feet all the time beating and running to the measure of the song, as if it were some strange incantation, her white, wrapped form drifting here and there, in a strange impulsive rhapsody, seeming to be lifted on a breeze of incantation, shuddering with strange little runs. Ursula sat on the grass, her mouth open in her singing, her eyes laughing as if she thought it was a great joke, but a yellow light flashing up in them as she caught some of the unconscious ritualistic suggestion of the complex shuddering and waving and drifting of her sister's white form that was clutched in pure, mindless, tossing rhythm and will set powerful in a kind of hypnotic influence. My love is a highborn lady. She is rather dark than shady. Rang out Ursula's laughing, satiric song, and quicker, fiercer went Gudrun in the dance, stamping as if she were trying to throw off some bond, flinging her hands suddenly and stamping again, then rushing with face uplifted and throat full and beautiful, and eyes half closed, sightless. The sun was low and yellow, sinking down, and in the sky floated a thin, ineffectual moon. Ursula was quite absorbed in her song, when suddenly Gudrun stopped and said mildly, ironically, Ursula. Yes, said Ursula, opening her eyes out of the trance. Gudrun was standing still and pointing, a mocking smile on her face, towards the side. Ugh, cried Ursula in sudden panic, starting to her feet. They're quite all right, rang out Gudrun's sardonic voice. On the left stood a little cluster of Highland cattle, vividly colored and fleecy in the evening light, their horns branching into the sky, pushing forward their muzzles inquisitively to know what it was all about. Their eyes glittered through their tangle of hair, their naked nostrils were full of shadow. Won't they do anything? Cried Ursula in fear. Gudrun, who was usually frightened of cattle, now shook her head in a queer, half-doubtful, half-sardonic motion, a faint smile round her mouth. Don't they look charming, Ursula? Cried Gudrun in a high, strident voice, something like the scream of a seagull. Charming, cried Ursula in trepidation. But won't they do anything to us? Again, Gudrun looked back at her sister with an enigmatic smile and shook her head. I'm sure they won't, she said, as if she had to convince herself also, and yet, as if she were confident of some secret power in herself, and had to put it to the test. Sit down and sing again, she called in her high, strident voice. I'm frightened, cried Ursula, in a pathetic voice, watching the group of sturdy short cattle that stood with their knees planted and watched with their dark, wicked eyes through the matted fringe of their hair. Nevertheless, she sank down again, in her former posture. They are quite safe, came Gudrun's high call. Sing something. You've only to sing something. It was evident she had a strange passion to dance before the sturdy, handsome cattle. Ursula began to sing, in a false, quavering voice. Way down in Tennessee. She sounded purely anxious. Nevertheless, Gudrun, with her arms outspread and her face uplifted, went in a strange, palpitating dance towards the cattle, lifting her body towards them as if in a spell, her feet pulsing as if in some little frenzy of unconscious sensation, her arms, her wrists, her hands stretching and heaving and falling and reaching and falling, her breasts lifted and shaken towards the cattle, her throat exposed as in some voluptuous ecstasy towards them, whilst she drifted imperceptibly, nearer, an uncanny white figure, towards them, carried away in its own rapt trance, ebbing in strange fluctuations upon the cattle, that waited and ducked their heads a little in sudden contraction from her, watching all the time as if hypnotized, their bare horns branching in the clear light, as the white figure of the woman ebbed upon them, in the slow, hypnotizing convulsion of the dance. She could feel them just in front of her. It was as if she had the electric pulse from their breasts running into her hands. Soon she would touch them, actually touch them. A terrible shiver of fear and pleasure went through her, and all the while, Ursula, spellbound, kept up her high-pitched, thin, irrelevant song, which pierced the fading evening like an incantation. Gudrun could hear the cattle breathing heavily with helpless fear and fascination. Oh, they were brave little beasts, these wild Scotch bullocks, wild and fleecy. Suddenly one of them snorted, ducked its head, and backed. Hugh, hi, came a sudden loud shout from the edge of the grove. The cattle broke and fell back quite spontaneously, went running up the hill, their fleece waving like fire to their motion. Gudrun stood suspended out on the grass. Ursula rose to her feet. It was Gerald and Birkin come to find them, and Gerald had cried out to frighten off the cattle. "What do you think you're doing?" he now called, in a high, wondering, vexed tone. "Why have you come?" came back Gudrun's strident cry of anger. "What do you think you were doing?" Gerald repeated, automatically. "We were doing eurythmics," laughed Ursula, in a shaken voice. Gudrun stood aloof looking at them with large dark eyes of resentment, suspended for a few moments. Then she walked away up the hill, after the cattle, which had gathered in a little, spellbound cluster higher up. "Where are you going?" Gerald called after her, and he followed her up the hillside. The sun had gone behind the hill, and shadows were clinging to the earth. The sky above was full of traveling light. "A poor song for a dance," said Birkin to Ursula, standing before her with a sardonic, flickering laugh on his face. And in another second, he was singing softly to himself and dancing a grotesque step dance in front of her, his limbs and body shaking loose, his face flickering palely, a constant thing, whilst his feet beat a rapid, mocking tattoo, and his body seemed to hang all loose and quaking in between, like a shadow. "I think we've all gone mad," she said, laughing rather frightened. "Pity we aren't madder," he answered, as he kept up the incessant shaking dance. Then suddenly he leaned up to her and kissed her fingers lightly, putting his face to hers and looking into her eyes with a pale grin. She stepped back, affronted. "Offended?" he asked ironically, suddenly going quite still and reserved again. "I thought you liked the light fantastic." "Not like that," she said, confused and bewildered, almost affronted. Yet somewhere inside her she was fascinated by the sight of his loose, vibrating body, perfectly abandoned to its own dropping and swinging, and by the pallid, sardonic smiling face above. Yet automatically she stiffened herself away and disapproved. It seemed almost an obscenity in a man who talked as a rule so very seriously. "Why not like that?" he mocked. And immediately he dropped again into the incredibly rapid, slack-waggling dance, watching her malevolently. And moving in the rapid, stationary dance, he came a little nearer and reached forward with an incredibly mocking, satiric gleam on his face, and would have kissed her again, had she not started back. "No, don't," she cried, really afraid. "Cordelia, after all," he said satirically. She was stung, as if this were an insult. She knew he intended it as such, and it bewildered her. "And you," she cried in retort, "why do you always take your soul in your mouth, so frightfully full?" "So that I can spit it out the more readily," he said, pleased by his own retort. Gerald Critch, his face narrowing to an intent gleam, followed up the hill with quick strides, straight after Gudrun. The cattle stood with their noses together on the brow of a slope, watching the scene below, the men in white hovering about the white forms of the women, watching above all Gudrun, who was advancing slowly towards them. She stood a moment, glancing back at Gerald, and then at the cattle. Then, in a sudden motion, she lifted her arms and rushed sheer upon the long-horned bullocks in shuddering irregular runs, pausing for a second and looking at them, then lifting her hands and running forward with a flash, till they ceased pawing the ground and gave way, snorting with terror, lifting their heads from the ground and flinging themselves away, galloping off into the evening, becoming tiny in the distance and still not stopping. Gudrun remained staring after them, with a mask-like, defiant face. "Why do you want to drive them mad?" asked Gerald, coming up with her. She took no notice of him, only averted her face from him. "It's not safe, you know," he persisted. "They're nasty when they do turn." "Turn where?" "Turn away," she mocked loudly. "No," he said. "Turn against you." "Turn against me?" she mocked. He could make nothing of this. "Anyway, they gored one of the farmer's cows to death the other day," he said. "What do I care?" she said. "I cared though," he replied, "seeing that they're my cattle." "How are they yours? You haven't swallowed them." "Give me one of them now," she said, holding out her hand. "You know where they are," he said, pointing over the hill. "You can have one if you'd like it sent to you later on." She looked at him inscrutably. "You think I'm afraid of you and your cattle, don't you?" she asked. His eyes narrowed dangerously. There was a faint, domineering smile on his face. "Why should I think that?" he said. She was watching him all the time with her dark, dilated, inchoate eyes. She leaned forward and swung round her arm, catching him a light blow on the face with the back of her hand. "That's why," she said, mocking. And she felt in her soul an unconquerable desire for deep violence against him. She shut off the fear and dismay that filled her conscious mind. She wanted to do as she did. She was not going to be afraid. He recoiled from the slight blow on his face. He became deadly pale, and a dangerous flame darkened his eyes. For some seconds he could not speak. His lungs were so suffused with blood, his heart stretched almost to bursting with a great gush of ungovernable emotion. It was as if some reservoir of black emotion had burst within him and swamped him. "You have struck the first blow," he said at last, forcing the words from his lungs, in a voice so soft and low, it sounded like a dream within her, not spoken in the outer air. "And I shall strike the last," she retorted involuntarily, with confident assurance. He was silent. He did not contradict her. She stood negligently, staring away from him, into the distance. On the edge of her consciousness, the question was asking itself, automatically, "Why are you behaving in this impossible and ridiculous fashion?" But she was sullen. She half shoved the question out of herself. She could not get it clean away, so she felt self-conscious. Gerald, very pale, was watching her closely. His eyes were lit up with intent lights, absorbed and gleaming. She turned suddenly on him. "It's you who make me behave like this, you know," she said, almost suggestive. "I? How?" he said. But she turned away and set off towards the lake. Below, on the water, lanterns were coming alight, faint ghosts of warm flame floating in the pallor of the first twilight. The earth was spread with darkness, like lacquer. Overhead was a pale sky, all primrose, and the lake was pale as milk in one part. Away at the landing stage, tiniest points of colored rays were stringing themselves in the dusk. The launch was being illuminated. All round, shadow was gathering from the trees. Gerald, white like a presence in his summer clothes, was following down the open, grassy slope. Gudrun waited for him to come up. Then she softly put out her hand and touched him, saying softly, "Don't be angry with me." A flame flew over him, and he was unconscious. Yet he stammered, "I'm not angry with you. I'm in love with you." His mind was gone. He grasped for sufficient mechanical control to save himself. She laughed a silvery little mockery, yet intolerably caressive. "That's one way of putting it," she said. The terrible swooning burden on his mind, the awful swooning, the loss of all his control, was too much for him. He grasped her arm in his one hand, as if his hand were iron. "It's all right then, is it?" he said, holding her arrested. She looked at the face with the fixed eyes set before her, and her blood ran cold. "Yes, it's all right," she said softly, as if drugged, her voice crooning and witch-like. He walked on beside her, a striding, mindless body, but he recovered a little as he went. He suffered badly. He had killed his brother when a boy and was set apart like Cain. They found Birkin and Ursula sitting together by the boats, talking and laughing. Birkin had been teasing Ursula. "Do you smell this little marsh?" he said, sniffing the air. He was very sensitive to scents and quick in understanding them. "It's rather nice," she said. "No," he replied, alarming. "Why alarming?" she laughed. "It seethes and seethes, a river of darkness," he said, putting forth lilies and snakes and the ignis fatuus, and rolling all the time onward. That's what we never take into account, that it rolls onwards. What does? The other river, the Black River. We always consider the silver river of life, rolling on and quickening all the world to a brightness, on and on to heaven, flowing into a bright eternal sea, a heaven of angels thronging. But the other is our real reality. But what other? "I don't see any other," said Ursula. "It is your reality. Nevertheless," he said, "that dark river of dissolution. You see, it rolls in us just as the other rolls, the black river of corruption. And our flowers are of this, our sea-born Aphrodite, all our white phosphorescent flowers of sensuous perfection, all our reality, nowadays." "You mean that Aphrodite is really deathly?" asked Ursula. "I mean she is the flowering mystery of the death process, yes," he replied. When the stream of synthetic creation lapses, we find ourselves part of the inverse process, the blood of destructive creation. Aphrodite is born in the first spasm of universal dissolution, then the snakes and swans and lotus, marsh flowers, and Gudrun and Gerald, born in the process of destructive creation. "And you and me?" she asked. "Probably," he replied. "In part, certainly. Whether we are that in toto, I don't yet know." "You mean we are flowers of dissolution, fleurs du mal?" "I don't feel as if I were," she protested. He was silent for a time. "I don't feel as if we were altogether," he replied. "Some people are pure flowers of dark corruption lilies. But there ought to be some roses, warm and flamy. You know Heraclitus says a dry soul is best." "I know so well what that means. Do you?" "I'm not sure," Ursula replied. "But what if people are all flowers of dissolution? When they're flowers at all, what difference does it make?" "No difference, and all the difference. Dissolution rolls on, just as production does," he said. "It is a progressive process, and it ends in universal nothing, the end of the world, if you like. But why isn't the end of the world as good as the beginning?" "I suppose it isn't," said Ursula, rather angry. "Oh yes, ultimately," he said. "It means a new cycle of creation after, but not for us. If it is the end, then we are of the end fleurs du mal, if you like. If we are fleurs du mal, we are not roses of happiness, and there you are." "But I think I am," said Ursula. "I think I am a rose of happiness." "Ready-made?" he asked ironically. "No, real," she said, hurt. "If we are the end, we are not the beginning," he said. "Yes, we are," she said. "The beginning comes out of the end. After it, not out of it. After us, not out of us." "You are a devil. You know, really," she said. "You want to destroy our hope. You want us to be deathly." "No," he said. "I only want us to know what we are." "Huh," she cried in anger. "You only want us to know death." "You're quite right," said the soft voice of Gerald, out of the dusk behind. Birkin rose. Gerald and Gudrun came up. They all began to smoke, in the moments of silence, one after another. Birkin lighted their cigarettes. The match flickered in the twilight, and they were all smoking peacefully by the waterside. The lake was dim, the light dying from off it, in the midst of the dark land. The air all round was intangible, neither here nor there, and there was an unreal noise of banjos, or such like music. As the golden swim of light overhead died out, the moon gained brightness and seemed to begin to smile forth her ascendancy. The dark woods on the opposite shore melted into universal shadow. And amid this universal undershadow, there was a scattered intrusion of lights. Far down the lake were fantastic pale strings of color, like beads of one fire, green and red and yellow. The music came out in a little puff as the launch, all illuminated, veered into the great shadow, stirring her outlines of half-living lights, puffing out her music in little drifts. All were lighting up, here and there, close against the faint water, and at the far end of the lake, where the water lay milky in the last whiteness of the sky, and there was no shadow, solitary, frail flames of lanterns floated from the unseen boats. There was a sound of oars, and a boat passed from the pallor into the darkness under the wood, where her lanterns seemed to kindle into fire, hanging in ruddy, lovely globes. And again, in the lake, shadowy red gleams hovered in reflection about the boat. Everywhere were these noiseless, ruddy creatures of fire drifting near the surface of the water, caught it by the rarest, scarce visible reflections. Birkin brought the lanterns from the bigger boat, and the four shadowy white figures gathered round to light them. Ursula held up the first. Birkin lowered the light from the rosy, glowing cup of his hands into the depths of the lantern. It was kindled, and they all stood back to look at the great blue moon of light that hung from Ursula's hand, casting a strange gleam on her face. It flickered, and Birkin went bending over the well of light. His face shone out like an apparition, so unconscious. And again, something demoniacal. Ursula was dim and veiled, looming over him. "That is all right," said his voice softly. She held up the lantern. It had a flight of storks streaming through a turquoise sky of light, over a dark earth. "This is beautiful," she said. "Lovely," echoed Gudrun, who wanted to hold one also, and lifted up full of beauty. "Light one for me," she said. Gerald stood by her, incapacitated. Birkin lit the lantern she held up. Her heart beat with anxiety to see how beautiful it would be. It was primrose yellow, with tall, straight flowers growing darkly from their dark leaves, lifting their heads into the primrose day, while butterflies hovered about them in the pure, clear light. Gudrun gave a little cry of excitement, as if pierced with delight. "Isn't it beautiful? Oh, isn't it beautiful?" Her soul was really pierced with beauty. She was translated beyond herself. Gerald leaned near to her, into her zone of light, as if to see. He came close to her and stood touching her, looking with her at the primrose shining globe. And she turned her face to his, that was faintly bright in the light of the lantern, and they stood together in one luminous union, close together and ringed round with light, all the rest excluded. Birkin looked away and went to light Ursula's second lantern. It had a pale, ruddy sea bottom, with black crabs and seaweed moving sinuously under a transparent sea that passed into flamy ruddiness above. "You've got the heavens above and the waters under the earth," said Birkin to her. "Anything but the earth itself," she laughed, watching his live hands that hovered to attend to the light. "I'm dying to see what my second one is," cried Gudrun, in a vibrating, rather strident voice that seemed to repel the others from her. Birkin went and kindled it. It was of a lovely deep blue color, with a red floor and a great white cuttlefish flowing in white soft streams all over it. The cuttlefish had a face that stared straight from the heart of the light, very fixed and coldly intent. "How truly terrifying," exclaimed Gudrun, in a voice of horror. Gerald, at her side, gave a low laugh. "But isn't it really fearful?" she cried in dismay. Again he laughed and said, "Change it with Ursula for the crabs." Gudrun was silent for a moment. "Ursula," she said, "could you bear to have this fearful thing?" "I think the coloring is lovely," said Ursula. "So do I," said Gudrun. "But could you bear to have it swinging to your boat? Don't you want to destroy it at once?" "Oh no," said Ursula. "I don't want to destroy it." "Well, do you mind having it instead of the crabs?" "Are you sure you don't mind?" Gudrun came forward to exchange lanterns. "No," said Ursula, yielding up the crabs and receiving the cuttlefish. Yet she could not help feeling rather resentful at the way in which Gudrun and Gerald should assume a right over her, a precedence. "Come then," said Birkin. "I'll put them on the boats." He and Ursula were moving away to the big boat. "I suppose you'll row me back, Rupert," said Gerald, out of the pale shadow of the evening. "Won't you go with Gudrun in the canoe?" said Birkin. "It'll be more interesting." There was a moment's pause. Birkin and Ursula stood dimly, with their swinging lanterns, by the water's edge. The world was all elusive. "Is that all right?" said Gudrun to him. "It'll suit me very well," he said. "But what about you and the rowing? I don't see why you should pull me." "Why not?" she said. "I can pull you as well as I could pull Ursula." By her tone, he could tell she wanted to have him in the boat to herself, and that she was subtly gratified that she should have power over them both. He gave himself in a strange, electric submission. She handed him the lanterns, whilst she went to fix the cane at the end of the canoe. He followed after her, and stood with the lanterns dangling against his white flannel thighs, emphasizing the shadow around. "Kiss me before we go," came his voice softly from out of the shadow above. She stopped her work in real, momentary astonishment. "But why?" she exclaimed, in pure surprise. "Why?" he echoed, ironically. And she looked at him fixedly for some moments. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, with a slow, luxurious kiss, lingering on the mouth. And then she took the lanterns from him, while he stood swooning with the perfect fire that burned in all his joints. They lifted the canoe into the water. Gudrun took her place, and Gerald pushed off. "Are you sure you don't hurt your hand doing that?" she asked, solicitous. "Because I could have done it perfectly." "I don't hurt myself," he said in a low, soft voice that caressed her with inexpressible beauty. And she watched him as he sat near her, very near to her, in the stern of the canoe, his legs coming towards hers, his feet touching hers. And she paddled softly, lingeringly, longing for him to say something meaningful to her. But he remained silent. "You like this, do you?" she said in a gentle, solicitous voice. He laughed shortly. "There is a space between us," he said, in the same low, unconscious voice, as if something were speaking out of him. And she was as if magically aware of their being balanced in separation in the boat. She swooned with acute comprehension and pleasure. "But I'm very near," she said caressively, gaily. "Yet distant," he said. Again she was silent with pleasure, before she answered, speaking with a reedy, thrilled voice. "Yet we cannot very well change, whilst we are on the water." She caressed him subtly and strangely, having him completely at her mercy. A dozen or more boats on the lake swung their rosy and moon-like lanterns low on the water, that reflected as from a fire. In the distance, the steamer twanged and thrummed and washed with her faintly splashing paddles, trailing her strings of colored lights, and occasionally lighting up the whole scene luridly with an effusion of fireworks, Roman candles and sheafs of stars and other simple effects, illuminating the surface of the water and showing the boats creeping round, low down. Then the lovely darkness fell again. The lanterns and the little threaded lights glimmered softly. There was a muffled knocking of oars and a waving of music. Gudrun paddled almost imperceptibly. Gerald could see, not far ahead, the rich blue and the rose globes of Ursula's lanterns swaying softly cheek to cheek as Birkin rode, and iridescent, evanescent gleams chasing in the wake. He was aware, too, of his own delicately colored lights casting their softness behind him. Gudrun rested her paddle and looked round. The canoe lifted with the lightest ebbing of the water. Gerald's white knees were very near to her. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said softly, as if reverently. She looked at him as he leaned back against the faint crystal of the lantern light. She could see his face, although it was a pure shadow, but it was a piece of twilight. And her breast was keen with passion for him. He was so beautiful in his male stillness and mystery. It was a certain pure effluence of maleness, like an aroma from his softly, firmly molded contours, a certain rich perfection of his presence that touched her with an ecstasy, a thrill of pure intoxication. She loved to look at him. For the present, she did not want to touch him, to know the further, satisfying substance of his living body. He was purely intangible, yet so near. Her hands lay on the paddle like slumber. She only wanted to see him, like a crystal shadow, to feel his essential presence. Yes, he said vaguely. It is very beautiful. He was listening to the faint near sounds, the dropping of water drops from the oar blades, the slight drumming of the lanterns behind him as they rubbed against one another, the occasional rustling of Gudrun's full skirt, an alien land noise. His mind was almost submerged. He was almost transfused, lapsed out for the first time in his life, into the things about him. For he always kept such a keen attentiveness, concentrated and unyielding in himself. Now he had let go. Imperceptibly, he was melting into oneness with the whole. It was like pure, perfect sleep, his first great sleep of life. He had been so insistent, so guarded, all his life. But here's sleep and peace and perfect lapsing out. "Shall I row to the landing stage?" asked Gudrun wistfully. "Anywhere," he answered. "Let it drift." "Tell me then, if we are running into anything," she replied, in that very quiet, toneless voice of sheer intimacy. "The lights will show," he said. So they drifted almost motionless, in silence. He wanted silence, pure and whole. But she was uneasy yet for some word, for some assurance. "Nobody will miss you?" she asked, anxious for some communication. "Miss me?" he echoed.
No.
"Why?" "I wondered if anybody would be looking for you. Why should they look for me?" And then he remembered his manners. "But perhaps you want to get back," he said, in a changed voice. "No, I don't want to get back," she replied. "No, I assure you." "You're quite sure it's all right for you?" "Perfectly all right." And again they were still. The launch twanged and hooted. Somebody was singing. Then, as if the night smashed, suddenly there was a great shout, a confusion of shouting, warring on the water. Then the horrid noise of paddles reversed and churned violently. Gerald sat up, and Gudrun looked at him in fear. "Somebody in the water," he said, angrily and desperately, looking keenly across the dusk. "Can you row up?" "Where? To the launch?" asked Gudrun, in nervous panic. "Yes." "You'll tell me if I don't steer straight," she said, in nervous apprehension. "You keep pretty level," he said, and the canoe hastened forward. The shouting and the noise continued, sounding horrid through the dusk, over the surface of the water. "Wasn't this bound to happen?" said Gudrun, with heavy, hateful irony. But he hardly heard, and she glanced over her shoulder to see her way. The half-dark waters were sprinkled with lovely bubbles of swaying lights. The launch did not look far off. She was rocking her lights in the early night. Gudrun rowed as hard as she could. But now that it was a serious matter, she seemed uncertain and clumsy in her stroke. It was difficult to paddle swiftly. She glanced at his face. He was looking fixedly into the darkness, very keen and alert and single in himself, instrumental. Her heart sank. She seemed to die a death. "Of course," she said to herself, "nobody will be drowned. Of course they won't. It would be too extravagant and sensational." But her heart was cold because of his sharp, impersonal face. It was as if he belonged naturally to dread and catastrophe, as if he were himself again. Then there came a child's voice, a girl's high, piercing shriek. D, 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 O, D, O, D, O, D. The blood ran cold in Gudrun's veins. "It's Diana, is it?" muttered Gerald. "The young monkey. She'd have to be up to some of her tricks." And he glanced again at the paddle. The boat was not going quickly enough for him. It made Gudrun almost helpless at the rowing, this nervous stress. She kept up with all her might. Still the voices were calling and answering. Where? There you are. That's it. Which? No, oh. Damn it all. Here. Boats were hurrying from all directions to the scene. Colored lanterns could be seen waving close to the surface of the lake, reflections swaying after them in uneven haste. The steamer hooted again, for some unknown reason. Gudrun's boat was traveling quickly. The lanterns were swinging behind Gerald. And then again came the child's high, screaming voice, with a note of weeping and impatience in it now. D, O, D, O, D, D. It was a terrible sound, coming through the obscure air of the evening. "You'd be better if you were in bed, Winnie," Gerald muttered to himself. He was stooping, unlacing his shoes, pushing them off with the foot. Then he threw his soft hat into the bottom of the boat. "You can't go into the water with your hurt hand," said Gudrun, panting, in a low voice of horror.
"What?"
"It won't hurt." He had struggled out of his jacket and had dropped it between his feet. He sat bareheaded, all in white now.
He felt the belt at his waist.
They were nearing the launch, which stood still big above them, her myriad lamps making lovely darts and sinuous running tongues of ugly red and green and yellow light on the lustrous, dark water under the shadow. "Oh, get her out."
"Odie, darling."
"Oh, get her out." "Oh, Daddy. Oh, Daddy," moaned the child's voice in distraction. Somebody was in the water with a life belt. 2 boats paddled near, their lanterns swinging ineffectually, the boats nosing round. "Hi there, Rockley. Hi there, Mr. Gerald," came the captain's terrified voice. "Miss Diana's in the water." "Anybody gone in for her?" came Gerald's sharp voice. "Young Dr. Brindle, sir." "Where?" "Can't see no signs of them, sir. Everybody's looking, but there's nothing so far." There was a moment's ominous pause. "Where did she go in?" "I think about where that boat is," came the uncertain answer. "That one with red and green lights." "Row there," said Gerald quietly to Gudrun. "Get her out, Gerald. Oh, get her out." The child's voice was crying anxiously. He took no heed. "Lean back that way," said Gerald to Gudrun as he stood up in the frail boat. "She won't upset." In another moment, he had dropped clean down, soft and plumb, into the water. Gudrun was swaying violently in her boat. The agitated water shook with transient lights. She realized that it was faintly moonlight and that he was gone. So it was possible to be gone. A terrible sense of fatality robbed her of all feeling and thought. She knew he was gone out of the world. There was merely the same world, and absence his absence. The night seemed large and vacuous. Lanterns swayed here and there. People were talking in an undertone on the launch and in the boats. She could hear Winifred moaning, "Oh, do find her, Gerald, do find her," and someone trying to comfort the child. Gudrun paddled aimlessly here and there. The terrible, massive, cold, boundless surface of the water terrified her beyond words. Would he never come back? She felt she must jump into the water too, to know the horror also. She started hearing someone say, "There he is." She saw the movement of his swimming, like a water rat, and she rowed involuntarily to him. But he was near another boat, a bigger one. Still she rowed towards him. She must be very near. She saw him. He looked like a seal. He looked like a seal as he took hold of the side of the boat. His fair hair was washed down on his round head. His face seemed to glisten suavely. She could hear him panting. Then he clambered into the boat. Oh, and the beauty of the subjection of his loins, white and dimly luminous as he climbed over the side of the boat, made her want to die. The beauty of his dim and luminous loins as he climbed into the boat, his back rounded and soft. Ah, this was too much for her, too final a vision. She knew it, and it was fatal. The terrible hopelessness of fate and of beauty. Such beauty. He was not like a man to her. He was an incarnation, a great phase of life. She saw him press the water out of his face and look at the bandage on his hand. And she knew it was all no good and that she would never go beyond him. He was the final approximation of life to her. "Put the lights out, we shall see better," came his voice, sudden and mechanical and belonging to the world of man. She could scarcely believe there was a world of man. She leaned round and blew out her lanterns. They were difficult to blow out. Everywhere the lights were gone save the colored points on the sides of the launch. The bluey-gray, early night spread level around. The moon was overhead. There were shadows of boats here and there. Again there was a splash, and he was gone under. Gudrun sat, sick at heart, frightened of the great, level surface of the water, so heavy and deadly. She was so alone, with the level, unliving field of the water stretching beneath her. It was not a good isolation. It was a terrible, cold separation of suspense. She was suspended upon the surface of the insidious reality until such time as she also should disappear beneath it. Then she knew, by a stirring of voices, that he had climbed out again into a boat. She sat wanting connection with him. Strenuously, she claimed her connection with him across the invisible space of the water. But round her heart was an isolation unbearable, through which nothing would penetrate. Take the launch in. It's no use keeping her there. Get lines for the dragging. Came the decisive, instrumental voice that was full of the sound of the world. The launch began gradually to beat the waters. Gerald, Gerald, came the wild, crying voice of Winifred. He did not answer. Slowly the launch drifted round in a pathetic, clumsy circle and slunk away to the land, retreating into the dimness. The wash of her paddles grew duller. Gudrun rocked in her light boat and dipped the paddle automatically to steady herself. Gudrun, called Ursula's voice. Ursula. The boats of the two sisters pulled together. Where's Gerald? Said Gudrun. He's dived again, said Ursula plaintively. And I know he ought not, with his hurt hand and everything. I'll take him in home this time, said Birkin. The boats swayed again from the wash of steamer. Gudrun and Ursula kept a lookout for Gerald. There he is, cried Ursula, who had the sharpest eyes. He had not been long under. Birkin pulled towards him, Gudrun following. He swam slowly and caught hold of the boat with his wounded hand. It slipped and he sank back. Why don't you help him? Cried Ursula sharply. He came again, and Birkin leaned to help him into the boat. Gudrun again watched Gerald climb out of the water, but this time slowly, heavily, with the blind clambering motions of an amphibious beast, clumsy. Again the moon shone with faint luminosity on his white, wet figure, on the stooping back and the rounded loins. But it looked defeated now. His body, it clambered and fell with slow clumsiness. He was breathing hoarsely too, like an animal that is suffering. He sat slack and motionless in the boat, his head blunt and blind like a seal's, his whole appearance inhuman, unknowing. Gudrun shuddered as she mechanically followed his boat. Birkin rowed, without speaking, to the landing stage. Where are you going? Gerald asked suddenly, as if just waking up. Home, said Birkin. Oh no, said Gerald imperiously. We can't go home while they're in the water. Turn back again. I'm going to find them. The women were frightened. His voice was so imperative and dangerous, almost mad, not to be opposed. No, said Birkin. You can't. There was a strange, fluid compulsion in his voice. Gerald was silent in a battle of wills. It was as if he would kill the other man. But Birkin rowed evenly and unswerving, with an inhuman inevitability. Why should you interfere? Said Gerald in hate. Birkin did not answer. He rowed towards the land. And Gerald sat mute, like a dumb beast, panting, his teeth chattering, his arms inert, his head like a seal's head. They came to the landing stage. Wet and naked-looking, Gerald climbed up the few steps. There stood his father in the night. Father, he said. Yes, my boy. Go home and get those things off. We shan't save them, father, said Gerald. There's hope yet, my boy. I'm afraid not. There's no knowing where they are. You can't find them. And there's a current as cold as hell. We'll let the water out, said the father. Go home, you, and look to yourself. See that he's looked after, Rupert, he added in a neutral voice. Well, father, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm afraid it's my fault, but it can't be helped. I've done what I could for the moment. I could go on diving, of course, not much though, and not much use. He moved away barefoot, on the planks of the platform. Then he trod on something sharp. Of course, you've got no shoes on, said Birkin. His shoes are here, cried Gudrun from below. She was making faster boat. Gerald waited for them to be brought to him. Gudrun came with them. He pulled them on his feet. If you once die, he said, then when it's over, it's finished. Why come to life again? There's room under that water there for thousands. 2 is enough, she said, murmuring. He dragged on his second shoe. He was shivering violently, and his jaw shook as he spoke. That's true, he said, maybe. But it's curious how much room there seems, a whole universe under there, and as cold as hell. You're as helpless as if your head was cut off. He could scarcely speak. He shook so violently. There's one thing about our family, you know, he continued. Once anything goes wrong, it can never be put right again. Not with us. I've noticed it all my life. You can't put a thing right once it has gone wrong. They were walking across the high road to the house. And when you are down there, it is so cold actually, and so endless, so different really from what it is on top. So endless. You wonder how it is so many are alive, why we're up here. Are you going? I shall see you again, shan't I? Good night, and thank you. Thank you very much. The two girls waited a while to see if there were any hope. The moon shone clearly overhead with almost impertinent brightness. The small dark boats clustered on the water. There were voices and subdued shouts, but it was all to no purpose. Gudrun went home when Birkin returned. He was commissioned to open the sluice that let out the water from the lake, which was pierced at one end near the high road, thus serving as a reservoir to supply with water the distant mines, in case of necessity. Come with me, he said to Ursula, and then I will walk home with you when I've done this. He called at the waterkeeper's cottage and took the key of the sluice. They went through a little gate from the high road to the head of the water, where was a great stone basin which received the overflow, and a flight of stone steps descended into the depths of the water itself. At the head of the steps was the lock of the sluice gate. The night was silver gray and perfect, save for the scattered restless sound of voices. The gray sheen of the moonlight caught the stretch of water. Dark boats flashed and moved. But Ursula's mind ceased to be receptive. Everything was unimportant and unreal. Birkin fixed the iron handle of the sluice and turned it with a wrench. The cogs began slowly to rise. He turned and turned, like a slave. His white figure became distinct. Ursula looked away. She could not bear to see him winding heavily and laboriously, bending and rising mechanically like a slave, turning the handle. Then, a real shock to her, there came a loud splashing of water from out of the dark, tree-filled hollow beyond the road, a splashing that deepened rapidly to a harsh roar, and then became a heavy, booming noise of a great body of water falling solidly all the time. It occupied the whole of the night, this great steady booming of water. Everything was drowned within it, drowned and lost. Ursula seemed to have to struggle for her life. She put her hands over her ears and looked at the high bland moon. "Can't we go now?" she cried to Birkin, who was watching the water on the steps to see if it would get any lower. It seemed to fascinate him. He looked at her and nodded. The little dark boats had moved nearer. People were crowding curiously along the hedge by the high road to see what was to be seen. Birkin and Ursula went to the cottage with the key, then turned their backs on the lake. She was in great haste. She could not bear the terrible crushing boom of the escaping water. "Do you think they are dead?" she cried in a high voice to make herself heard. "Yes," he replied. "Isn't it horrible?" He paid no heed. They walked up the hill, further and further away from the noise. "Do you mind very much?" she asked him. "I don't mind about the dead," he said. "Once they are dead, the worst of it is, they cling on to the living and won't let go." She pondered for a time. "Yes," she said. "The fact of death doesn't really seem to matter much, does it?" "No," he said. "What does it matter if Diana Critch is alive or dead?" "Doesn't it?" she said, shocked. "No, why should it? Better she were dead. She'll be much more real. She'll be positive in death. In life, she was a fretting, negated thing." "You are rather horrible," murmured Ursula. "No. I'd rather Diana Critch were dead. Her living somehow was all wrong. As for the young man, poor devil, he'll find his way out quickly instead of slowly. Death is all right, nothing better." "Yet you don't want to die," she challenged him. He was silent for a time. Then he said, in a voice that was frightening to her in its change, "I should like to be through with it. I should like to be through with the death process." "And aren't you?" asked Ursula nervously. They walked on for some way in silence under the trees. Then he said, slowly, as if afraid, "There is life which belongs to death, and there is life which isn't death. One is tired of the life that belongs to death, our kind of life, but whether it is finished, God knows. I want love that is like sleep, like being born again, vulnerable as a baby that just comes into the world." Ursula listened, half attentive, half avoiding what he said. She seemed to catch the drift of his statement, and then she drew away. She wanted to hear, but she did not want to be implicated. She was reluctant to yield there, where he wanted her, to yield as it were her very identity. "Why should love be like sleep?" she asked sadly. "I don't know. So that it is like death. I do want to die from this life, and yet it is more than life itself. One is delivered over like a naked infant from the womb, all the old defenses and the old body gone, and new air around one that has never been breathed before." She listened, making out what he said. She knew, as well as he knew, that words themselves do not convey meaning, that they are but a gesture we make, a dumb show like any other. And she seemed to feel his gesture through her blood, and she drew back, even though her desire sent her forward. "But," she said gravely, "didn't you say you wanted something that was not love, something beyond love?" He turned in confusion. There was always confusion in speech, yet it must be spoken. Whichever way one moved, if one were to move forwards, one must break a way through. And to know, to give utterance, was to break a way through the walls of the prison as the infant in labor strives through the walls of the womb. There is no new movement now without the breaking through of the old body, deliberately, in knowledge, in the struggle to get out. "I don't want love," he said. "I don't want to know you. I want to be gone out of myself, and you to be lost yourself, so we are found different. One shouldn't talk when one is tired and wretched. One Hamletizes, and it seems a lie. Only believe me when I show you a bit of healthy pride and insouciance. I hate myself serious." "Why shouldn't you be serious?" she said. He thought for a minute. Then he said, sulkily, "I don't know." Then they walked on in silence at outs. He was vague and lost. "Isn't it strange," she said, suddenly putting her hand on his arm with a loving impulse, "how we always talk like this? I suppose we do love each other in some way." "Oh yes," he said, "too much." She laughed almost gaily. "You have to have it your own way, wouldn't you?" she teased. "You could never take it on trust." He changed, laughed softly, and turned and took her in his arms, in the middle of the road. "Yes," he said softly. And he kissed her face and brow, slowly, gently, with a sort of delicate happiness which surprised her extremely, and to which she could not respond. They were soft, blind kisses, perfect in their stillness. Yet she held back from them. It was like strange moths, very soft and silent, settling on her from the darkness of her soul. She was uneasy. She drew away. "Isn't somebody coming?" she said. So they looked down the dark road, then set off again, walking towards Beldover. Then suddenly, to show him she was no shallow prude, she stopped and held him tight, hard against her, and covered his face with hard, fierce kisses of passion. In spite of his otherness, the old blood beat up in him. "Not this, not this," he whimpered to himself, as the first perfect mood of softness and sleep-loveliness ebbed back away from the rushing of passion that came up to his limbs and over his face as she drew him. And soon he was a perfect hard flame of passionate desire for her. Yet in the small core of the flame was an unyielding anguish of another thing. But this also was lost. He only wanted her, with an extreme desire that seemed inevitable as death, beyond question. Then, satisfied and shattered, fulfilled and destroyed, he went home away from her, drifting vaguely through the darkness, lapsed into the old fire of burning passion. Far away, there seemed to be a small lament in the darkness. But what did it matter? What did it matter? What did anything matter save this ultimate and triumphant experience of physical passion that had blazed up anew like a new spell of life? "I was becoming quite dead alive, nothing but a word bag," he said in triumph, scorning his other self. Yet somewhere far off and small, the other hovered. The men were still dragging the lake when he got back. He stood on the bank and heard Gerald's voice. The water was still booming in the night. The moon was fair. The hills beyond were elusive. The lake was sinking. There came the raw smell of the banks in the night air. Up at Shortlands there were lights in the windows, as if nobody had gone to bed. On the landing stage was the old doctor, the father of the young man who was lost. He stood quite silent, waiting. Birkin also stood and watched. Gerald came up in a boat. "You still here, Rupert?" he said. "We can't get them. The bottom slopes, very steep. The water lies between two very sharp slopes with little branch valleys, and God knows where the drift will take you. It isn't as if it was a level bottom. You never know where you are with the dragging." "Is there any need for you to be working?" said Birkin. "Wouldn't it be much better if you went to bed?"
To bed.
"Good God, do you think I should sleep?" "Well, find them before I go away from here." "But the men would find them just the same without you. Why should you insist?" Gerald looked up at him. Then he put his hand affectionately on Birkin's shoulder, saying, "Don't you bother about me, Rupert. If there's anybody's health to think about, it's yours, not mine. How do you feel yourself?" "Very well, but you spoil your own chance of life. You waste your best self." Gerald was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Waste it? What else is there to do with it? But leave this, won't you? You force yourself into horrors and put a millstone of beastly memories round your neck. Come away now." "A millstone of beastly memories," Gerald repeated. Then he put his hand again affectionately on Birkin's shoulder. "God, you've got such a telling way of putting things, Rupert, you have." Birkin's heart sank. He was irritated and weary of having a telling way of putting things. "Won't you leave it? Come over to my place," he urged as one urges a drunken man. "No," said Gerald coaxingly, his arm across the other man's shoulder. "Thanks very much, Rupert. I shall be glad to come tomorrow if that'll do. You understand, don't you? I want to see this job through. But I'll come tomorrow, right enough." "Oh, I'd rather come and have a chat with you than do anything else. I verily believe." "Yes, I would. You mean a lot to me, Rupert, more than you know." "What do I mean, more than I know?" asked Birkin irritably. He was acutely aware of Gerald's hand on his shoulder, and he did not want this altercation. He wanted the other man to come out of the ugly misery. "I'll tell you another time," said Gerald coaxingly. "Come along with me now, I want you to come," said Birkin. There was a pause, intense and real. Birkin wondered why his own heart beat so heavily. Then Gerald's fingers gripped hard and communicative into Birkin's shoulder as he said, "No, I'll see this job through, Rupert. Thank you, I know what you mean. We're all right, you and me." "I may be all right, but I'm sure you're not mucking about here," said Birkin. And he went away. The bodies of the dead were not recovered till towards dawn. Diana had her arms tight round the neck of the young man, choking him. "She killed him," said Gerald. The moon sloped down the sky and sank at last. The lake was sunk to quarter size. It had horrible raw banks of clay that smelled of raw, rottenish water. Dawn roused faintly behind the eastern hill. The water still boomed through the sluice. As the birds were whistling for the first morning, and the hills at the back of the desolate lake stood radiant with the new mists, there was a straggling procession up to Shortlands, men bearing the bodies on a stretcher, Gerald going beside them, the two gray-bearded fathers following in silence. Indoors, the family was all sitting up, waiting. Somebody must go to tell the mother in her room. The doctor in secret struggled to bring back his son, till he himself was exhausted. Over all the outlying district was a hush of dreadful excitement on that Sunday morning. The colliery people felt as if this catastrophe had happened directly to themselves. Indeed, they were more shocked and frightened than if their own men had been killed. Such a tragedy in Shortlands, the high home of the district. One of the young mistresses, persisting in dancing on the cabin roof of the launch, willful young madam, drowned in the midst of the festival, with the young doctor. Everywhere on the Sunday morning, the colliers wandered about, discussing the calamity. At all the Sunday dinners of the people, there seemed a strange presence. It was as if the angel of death were very near. There was a sense of the supernatural in the air. The men had excited, startled faces. The women looked solemn. Some of them had been crying. The children enjoyed the excitement at first. There was an intensity in the air, almost magical. Did all enjoy it? Did all enjoy the thrill? Gudrun had wild ideas of rushing to comfort Gerald. She was thinking all the time of the perfect comforting, reassuring thing to say to him. She was shocked and frightened, But she put that away, thinking of how she should deport herself with Gerald. Act her part. That was the real thrill. How she should act her part. Ursula was deeply and passionately in love with Birkin, and she was capable of nothing. She was perfectly callous about all the talk of the accident, but her estranged air looked like trouble. She merely sat by herself, whenever she could, and longed to see him again. She wanted him to come to the house. She would not have it otherwise. He must come at once. She was waiting for him. She stayed indoors all day, waiting for him to knock at the door. Every minute, she glanced automatically at the window. He would be there. 15. Sunday evening. As the day wore on, the lifeblood seemed to ebb away from Ursula, and within the emptiness, a heavy despair gathered. Her passions seemed to bleed to death, and there was nothing. She sat suspended in a state of complete nullity, harder to bear than death. Unless something happens, she said to herself, in the perfect lucidity of final suffering, I shall die. I am at the end of my line of life. She sat crushed and obliterated in a darkness that was the border of death. She realized how all her life she had been drawing nearer and nearer to this brink, where there was no beyond, from which one had to leap like Sappho into the unknown. The knowledge of the imminence of death was like a drug. Darkly, without thinking at all, she knew that she was near to death. She had traveled all her life along the line of fulfillment, and it was nearly concluded. She knew all she had to know. She had experienced all she had to experience. She was fulfilled in a kind of bitter ripeness. There remained only to fall from the tree into death. And one must fulfill one's development to the end, must carry the adventure to its conclusion. And the next step was over the border into death. So, it was then. There was a certain peace in the knowledge. After all, when one was fulfilled, one was happiest in falling into death, as a bitter fruit plunges in its ripeness downwards. Death is a great consummation, a consummating experience. It is a development from life that we know while we are yet living. What then need we think for further? One can never see beyond the consummation. It is enough that death is a great and conclusive experience. Why should we ask what comes after the experience when the experience is still unknown to us? Let us die, since the great experience is the one that follows now upon all the rest, death, which is the next great crisis in front of which we have arrived. If we wait, if we balk the issue, we do but hang about the gates in undignified uneasiness. There it is in front of us, as in front of Sappho, the illimitable space. Thereinto goes the journey. Have we not the courage to go on with our journey? Must we cry daren't? On ahead we will go, into death, and whatever death may mean. If a man can see the next step to be taken, why should he fear the next but one? Why ask about the next but one? Of the next step we are certain. It is the step into death. I shall die, I shall quickly die, said Ursula to herself, clear as if in a trance, clear, calm, and certain beyond human certainty. But somewhere behind, in the twilight, there was a bitter weeping and a hopelessness that must not be attended to. One must go where the unfaltering spirit goes. There must be no balking the issue because of fear. No balking the issue, no listening to the lesser voices. If the deepest desire be now to go on into the unknown of death, shall one forfeit the deepest truth for one more shallow? Then let it end, she said to herself. It was a decision. It was not a question of taking one's life. She would never kill herself. That was repulsive and violent. It was a question of knowing the next step. And the next step led into the space of death. Did it? Or was there? Her thoughts drifted into unconsciousness. She sat as if asleep beside the fire. And then the thought came back. The space of death. Could she give herself to it? Ah, yes, it was asleep. She had had enough. So long she had held out and resisted. Now was the time to relinquish, not to resist anymore. In a kind of spiritual trance, she yielded, she gave way, and all was dark. She could feel, within the darkness, the terrible assertion of her body, the unutterable anguish of dissolution, the only anguish that is too much, the far-off, awful nausea of dissolution set in within the body. Does the body correspond so immediately with the spirit? She asked herself. And she knew, with the clarity of ultimate knowledge, that the body is only one of the manifestations of the spirit. The transmutation of the integral spirit is the transmutation of the physical body as well. Unless I set my will, unless I absolve myself from the rhythm of life, fix myself and remain static, cut off from living, absolved within my own will. But better die than live mechanically a life that is a repetition of repetitions. To die is to move on with the invisible. To die is also a joy of submitting to that which is greater than the known, namely, the pure unknown. That is a joy. But to live mechanized and cut off within the motion of the will, to live as an entity absolved from the unknown, that is shameful and ignominious. There is no ignominy in death. There is complete ignominy in an unreplenished, mechanized life. Life indeed may be ignominious, shameful to the soul. But death is never a shame. Death itself, like the illimitable space, is beyond our sullying. Tomorrow was Monday. Monday, the beginning of another school week. Another shameful, barren school week, mere routine and mechanical activity. Was not the adventure of death infinitely preferable? Was not death infinitely more lovely and noble than such a life? A life of barren routine, without inner meaning, without any real significance. How sordid life was, how it was a terrible shame to the soul. To live now, how much cleaner and more dignified to be dead. One could not bear any more of this shame of sordid routine and mechanical nullity. One might come to fruit in death. She had had enough. For where was life to be found? No flowers grow upon busy machinery. There is no sky to a routine. There is no space to a rotary motion. And all life was a rotary motion, mechanized, cut off from reality. There was nothing to look for from life. It was the same in all countries and all peoples. The only window was death. One could look out onto the great dark sky of death with elation, as one had looked out of the classroom window as a child and seen perfect freedom in the outside. Now one was not a child, and one knew that the soul was a prisoner within this sordid, vast edifice of life, and there was no escape, save in death. But what a joy, what a gladness to think that whatever humanity did, it could not seize hold of the kingdom of death, to nullify that. The sea they turned into a murderous alley and a soiled road of commerce, disputed like the dirty land of a city, every inch of it. The air they claimed too, shared it up, parceled it out to certain owners. They trespassed in the air to fight for it. Everything was gone, walled in, with spikes on top of the walls, and one must ignominiously creep between the spiky walls through a labyrinth of life. But the great, dark, illimitable kingdom of death, their humanity was put to scorn. So much they could do upon earth, the multifarious little gods that they were. But the kingdom of death put them all to scorn. They dwindled into their true vulgar silliness in face of it. How beautiful, how grand and perfect death was, how good to look forward to. There one would wash off all the lies and ignominy and dirt that had been put upon one here, a perfect bath of cleanness and glad refreshment, and go unknown, unquestioned, unabased. After all, one was rich, if only in the promise of perfect death. It was a gladness above all, that this remained to look forward to, the pure and human otherness of death. Whatever life might be, it could not take away death, the inhuman transcendent death. Oh, let us ask no question of it, what it is or is not. To know is human, and in death we do not know, we are not human. And the joy of this compensates for all the bitterness of knowledge and the sordidness of our humanity. In death we shall not be human, and we shall not know. The promise of this is our heritage. We look forward like heirs to their majority. Ursula sat quite still and quite forgotten, alone by the fire in the drawing room. The children were playing in the kitchen. All the others were gone to church, and she was gone into the ultimate darkness of her own soul. She was startled by hearing the bell ring. Away in the kitchen, the children came scudding along the passage in delicious alarm. Ursula, there's somebody. I know.
Don't be silly, she replied.
She too was startled, almost frightened. She dared hardly go to the door. Birkin stood on the threshold, his raincoat turned up to his ears. He had come now. Now she was gone far away. She was aware of the rainy night behind him. "Oh, is it you?" she said. "I am glad you are at home," he said in a low voice, entering the house. "They are all gone to church." He took off his coat and hung it up. The children were peeping at him round the corner. "Go and get undressed now, Billy and Dora," said Ursula. "Mother will be back soon, and she'll be disappointed if you're not in bed." The children, in a sudden angelic mood, retired without a word. Birkin and Ursula went into the drawing room. The fire burned low. He looked at her and wondered at the luminous delicacy of her beauty and the wide shining of her eyes. He watched from a distance, with wonder in his heart. She seemed transfigured with light. "What have you been doing all day?" he asked her.
"Only sitting about," she said.
He looked at her. There was a change in her, but she was separate from him. She remained apart, in a kind of brightness. They both sat silent in the soft light of the lamp. He felt he ought to go away again. He ought not to have come. Still, he did not gather enough resolution to move. But he was de trop. Her mood was absent and separate. Then there came the voices of the two children calling shyly outside the door, softly, with self-excited timidity. "Ursula! Ursula!" She rose and opened the door. On the threshold stood the two children in their long nightgowns, with wide-eyed, angelic faces. They were being very good for the moment, playing the role perfectly of two obedient children. "Shall you take us to bed?" said Billy in a loud whisper. "Why, you are angels tonight," she said softly. "Won't you come and say good night to Mr. Birkin?" The children merged shyly into the room, on bare feet. Billy's face was wide and grinning, but there was a great solemnity of being good in his round blue eyes. Dora, peeping from the floss of her fair hair, hung back like some tiny dryad that has no soul. "Will you say good night to me?" asked Birkin, in a voice that was strangely soft and smooth. Dora drifted away at once, like a leaf lifted on a breath of wind. But Billy went softly forward, slow and willing, lifting his pinched-up mouth implicitly to be kissed. Ursula watched the full, gathered lips of the man gently touch those of the boy, so gently. Then Birkin lifted his fingers and touched the boy's round, confiding cheek, with a faint touch of love. Neither spoke. Billy seemed angelic, like a cherub boy, or like an acolyte. Birkin was a tall, grave angel looking down to him. "Are you going to be kissed?" Ursula broke in, speaking to the little girl. But Dora edged away like a tiny dryad that will not be touched. "Won't you say good night to Mr. Birkin?" "Go, he's waiting for you," said Ursula. But the girl child only made a little motion away from him. Silly Dora," said Ursula. Birkin felt some mistrust and antagonism in the small child. He could not understand it. "Come then," said Ursula. "Let us go before Mother comes." "Who'll hear us say our prayers?" asked Billy anxiously. "Whom you like." "Won't you?" "Yes, I will." "Ursula." "Well, Billy, is it whom you like?" "That's it." "Well, what is whom?" "It's the accusative of who." There was a moment's contemplative silence, then the confiding. "Is it?" Birkin smiled to himself as he sat by the fire. When Ursula came down, he sat motionless, with his arms on his knees. She saw him, how he was motionless and ageless, like some crouching idol, some image of a deathly religion. He looked round at her, and his face, very pale and unreal, seemed to gleam with a whiteness almost phosphorescent. "Don't you feel well?" she asked, in indefinable repulsion. "I hadn't thought about it. But don't you know without thinking about it?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and swift, and he saw her revulsion. He did not answer her question. "Don't you know whether you are unwell or not, without thinking about it?" she persisted. "Not always," he said coldly. "But don't you think that's very wicked?" "Wicked?"
"Yes."
"I think it's criminal to have so little connection with your own body that you don't even know when you are ill." He looked at her darkly. "Yes," he said. "Why don't you stay in bed when you are seedy? You look perfectly ghastly." Offensively so? He asked ironically. Yes, quite offensive. Quite repelling.
Ah,
Well, that's unfortunate. And it's raining, and it's a horrible night. Really, you shouldn't be forgiven for treating your body like it. You ought to suffer. A man who takes as little notice of his body as that. Takes as little notice of his body as that, he echoed mechanically. This cut her short, and there was silence. The others came in from church, and the two had the girls to face, then the mother and Gudrun, and then the father and the boy. Good evening, said Brangwen, faintly surprised. Came to see me, did you? No, said Birkin, not about anything in particular, that is. The day was dismal, and I thought you wouldn't mind if I called in. It has been a depressing day, said Mrs. Brangwen sympathetically. At that moment, the voices of the children were heard calling from upstairs. Mother, mother. She lifted her face and answered mildly into the distance. I shall come up to you in a minute, Doisy. Then to Birkin. There is nothing fresh at Shortlands, I suppose? Ah, she sighed. No, poor things, I should think not. You've been over there today, I suppose? Asked the father. Gerald came round to tea with me, and I walked back with him. The house is overexcited and unwholesome, I thought. I should think they were people who hadn't much restraint, said Gudrun. Or too much, Birkin answered. Oh yes, I'm sure, said Gudrun, almost vindicatively. One or the other. They all feel they ought to behave in some unnatural fashion, said Birkin. When people are in grief, they would do better to cover their faces and keep in retirement, as in the old days. Certainly, cried Gudrun, flushed and inflammable. What can be worse than this public grief? What is more horrible, more false? If grief is not private and hidden, what is? Exactly, he said. I felt ashamed when I was there, and they were all going about in a lugubrious false way, feeling they must not be natural or ordinary. Well, said Mrs. Brangwen, offended at this criticism, it isn't so easy to bear a trouble like that. And she went upstairs to the children. He remained only a few minutes longer, then took his leave. When he was gone, Ursula felt such a poignant hatred of him that all her brain seemed turned into a sharp crystal of fine hatred. Her whole nature seemed sharpened and intensified into a pure dart of hate. She could not imagine what it was. It merely took hold of her, the most poignant and ultimate hatred, pure and clear and beyond thought. She could not think of it at all. She was translated beyond herself. It was like a possession. She felt she was possessed. And for several days, she went about possessed by this exquisite force of hatred against him. It surpassed anything she had ever known before. It seemed to throw her out of the world into some terrible region where nothing of her old life held good. She was quite lost and dazed, really dead to her own life. It was so completely incomprehensible and irrational. She did not know why she hated him. Her hate was quite abstract. She had only realized with a shock that stunned her that she was overcome by this pure transportation. He was the enemy, fine as a diamond, and as hard and jewel-like, the quintessence of all that was inimical. She thought of his face, white and purely wrought, and of his eyes that had such a dark, constant will of assertion, and she touched her own forehead to feel if she were mad. She was so transfigured in white flame of essential hate. It was not temporal, her hatred. She did not hate him for this or for that. She did not want to do anything to him, to have any connection with him. Her relation was ultimate and utterly beyond words. The hate was so pure and gem-like. It was as if he were a beam of essential enmity, a beam of light that did not only destroy her, but denied her altogether, revoked her whole world. She saw him as a clear stroke of uttermost contradiction, a strange gem-like being whose existence defined her own non-existence. When she heard he was ill again, her hatred only intensified itself a few degrees, if that were possible. It stunned her and annihilated her, but she could not escape it. She could not escape this transfiguration of hatred that had come upon her.
16. Man to man.
He lay sick and unmoved, in pure opposition to everything. He knew how near to breaking was the vessel that held his life. He knew also how strong and durable it was, and he did not care. Better 1,000 times take one's chance with death than accept a life one did not want. But best of all, to persist and persist and persist forever till one were satisfied in life. He knew that Ursula was referred back to him. He knew his life rested with her, but he would rather not live than accept the love she proffered. The old way of love seemed a dreadful bondage, a sort of conscription. What it was in him he did not know, but the thought of love, marriage, and children, and a life lived together in the horrible privacy of domestic and connubial satisfaction was repulsive. He wanted something clearer, more open, cooler, as it were. The hot, narrow intimacy between man and wife was abhorrent. The way they shut their doors, these married people, and shut themselves into their own exclusive alliance with each other, even in love, disgusted him. It was a whole community of mistrustful couples insulated in private houses or private rooms, always in couples, and no further life, no further immediate, no disinterested relationship admitted. A kaleidoscope of couples, disjoined, separatist, meaningless entities of married couples. True, he hated promiscuity even worse than marriage, and a liaison was only another kind of coupling, reactionary from the legal marriage. Reaction was a greater bore than action. On the whole, he hated sex. It was such a limitation. It was sex that turned a man into a broken half of a couple, the woman into the other broken half. And he wanted to be single in himself, the woman single in herself. He wanted sex to revert to the level of the other appetites, to be regarded as a functional process, not as a fulfillment. He believed in sex marriage. But beyond this, he wanted a further conjunction, where man had being and woman had being, two pure beings, each constituting the freedom of the other, balancing each other like two poles of one force, like two angels or two demons. He wanted so much to be free, not under the compulsion of any need for unification, or tortured by unsatisfied desire. Desire and aspiration should find their object without all this torture, as now, in a world of plenty of water, simple thirst is inconsiderable, satisfied almost unconsciously. And he wanted to be with Ursula as free as with himself, single and clear and cool, yet balanced, polarized with her. The merging, the clutching, the mingling of love was become madly abhorrent to him. But it seemed to him, woman was always so horrible and clutching. She had such a lust for possession, a greed of self-importance in love. She wanted to have, to own, to control, to be dominant. Everything must be referred back to her, to woman, the great mother of everything, out of whom proceeded everything, and to whom everything must finally be rendered up. It filled him with almost insane fury, this calm assumption of the magna mater, that all was hers, because she had borne it. Man was hers because she had borne him. A mater dolorosa, she had borne him. A magna mater, she now claimed him again, soul and body, sex, meaning, and all. He had a horror of the magna mater. She was detestable. She was on a very high horse again, was woman, the great mother. Did he not know it in Hermione? Hermione, the humble, the subservient. What was she all the while but the mater dolorosa, in her subservience, claiming with horrible, insidious arrogance and female tyranny, her own again, claiming back the man she had borne in suffering. By her very suffering and humility, she bound her son with chains. She held him her everlasting prisoner. And Ursula was the same or the inverse. She too was the awful, arrogant queen of life, as if she were a queen bee on whom all the rest depended. He saw the yellow flare in her eyes. He knew the unthinkable, overweening assumption of primacy in her. She was unconscious of it herself. She was only too ready to knock her head on the ground before a man. But this was only when she was so certain of her man that she could worship him as a woman worships her own infant, with a worship of perfect possession. It was intolerable, this possession at the hands of woman. Always a man must be considered as the broken-off fragment of a woman, and the sex was the still aching scar of the laceration. Man must be added on to a woman before he had any real place or wholeness.
And why?
Why should we consider ourselves, men and women, as broken fragments of one whole? It is not true. We are not broken fragments of one whole. Rather, we are the singling away into purity and clear being of things that were mixed. Rather, the sex is that which remains in us of the mixed, the unresolved. And passion is the further separating of this mixture, that which is manly being taken into the being of the man, that which is womanly passing to the woman, till the two are clear and whole as angels, the admixture of sex in the highest sense surpassed, leaving two single beings constellated together like two stars. In the old age, before sex was, we were mixed, each one a mixture. The process of singling into individuality resulted into the great polarization of sex. The womanly drew to one side, the manly to the other, but the separation was imperfect even then. And so our world cycle passes. There is now to come the new day, when we are beings, each of us, fulfilled in difference. The man is pure man, the woman pure woman. They are perfectly polarized. But there is no longer any of the horrible merging, mingling self-abnegation of love. There is only the pure duality of polarization, each one free from any contamination of the other. In each, the individual is primal, sex is subordinate, but perfectly polarized. Each has a single, separate being with its own laws. The man has his pure freedom, the woman hers. Each acknowledges the perfection of the polarized sex circuit. Each admits the different nature in the other. So Birkin meditated whilst he was ill. He liked sometimes to be ill enough to take to his bed, for then he got better very quickly, and things came to him clear and sure. Whilst he was laid up, Gerald came to see him. The two men had a deep, uneasy feeling for each other. Gerald's eyes were quick and restless, his whole manner tense and impatient. He seemed strung up to some activity. According to conventionality, he wore black clothes. He looked formal, handsome, and comme il faut. His hair was fair almost to whiteness, sharp like splinters of light. His face was keen and ruddy. His body seemed full of northern energy. Gerald really loved Birkin, though he never quite believed in him. Birkin was too unreal. Clever, whimsical, wonderful, but not practical enough. Gerald felt that his own understanding was much sounder and safer. Birkin was delightful, a wonderful spirit, but after all, not to be taken seriously, not quite to be counted as a man among men. "Why are you laid up again?" he asked kindly, taking the sick man's hand. It was always Gerald who was protective, offering the warm shelter of his physical strength. "For my sins, I suppose," Birkin said, smiling a little ironically. "For your sins? Yes, probably that is so. You should sin less and keep better in health." "You'd better teach me." He looked at Gerald with ironic eyes. "How are things with you?" asked Birkin. "With me?" Gerald looked at Birkin, saw he was serious, and a warm light came into his eyes. "I don't know that they're any different. I don't see how they could be. There's nothing to change. I suppose you are conducting the business as successfully as ever, and ignoring the demand of the soul." "That's it," said Gerald. "At least as far as the business is concerned. I couldn't say about the soul, I am sure."
No.
"Surely you don't expect me to?" laughed Gerald.
No.
"How are the rest of your affairs progressing, apart from the business?" "The rest of my affairs? What are those?" "I couldn't say. I don't know what you refer to." "Yes, you do," said Birkin. "Are you gloomy or cheerful? And what about Gudrun Brangwen?" "What about her?" A confused look came over Gerald. "Well," he added, "I don't know. I can only tell you she gave me a hit over the face last time I saw her." "A hit over the face? What for?" "That I couldn't tell you either." "Really? But when?" "The night of the party, when Diana was drowned. She was driving the cattle up the hill, and I went after her, you remember?" "Yes, I remember. But what made her do that? You didn't definitely ask her for it, I suppose?" No, not that I know of. I merely said to her that it was dangerous to drive those Highland bullocks, as it is." She turned in such a way and said, "I suppose you think I'm afraid of you and your cattle, don't you?" So I asked her, why, and for answer, she flung me a backhander across the face. Birkin laughed quickly, as if it pleased him. Gerald looked at him, wondering, and began to laugh as well, saying, "I didn't laugh at the time, I assure you. I was never so taken aback in my life." "And weren't you furious?" "Furious? I should think I was. I'd have murdered her for 2 pins."
Hachem, éjacula-t-elle Birkin.
Poor Gudrun. Wouldn't she suffer afterwards for having given herself away? He was hugely delighted. Would she suffer? Asked Gerald, also amused now. Both men smiled in malice and amusement. Badly, I should think, seeing how self-conscious she is. She is self-conscious, is she? Then what made her do it? For I certainly think it was quite uncalled for and quite unjustified. I suppose it was a sudden impulse. Yes, but how do you account for her having such an impulse? I'd done her no harm. Birkin shook his head. The Amazon suddenly came up in her, I suppose, he said. Well, replied Gerald, I'd rather it had been the Orinoco. They both laughed at the poor joke. Gerald was thinking how Gudrun had said she would strike the last blow too. But some reserve made him keep this back from Birkin. And you resent it?
Birkin asked.
I don't resent it. I don't care a tinker's curse about it. He was silent a moment. Then he added, laughing. No, I'll see it through, that's all. She seemed sorry afterwards. Did she? You've not met since that night? Gerald's face clouded.
No, he said.
We've been. You can imagine how it's been since the accident.
Yes.
Is it calming down? I don't know. It's a shock, of course. But I don't believe Mother minds. I really don't believe she takes any notice. And what's so funny? She used to be all for the children. Nothing mattered. Nothing whatever mattered but the children. And now, she doesn't take any more notice than if it was one of the servants.
No?
Did it upset you very much? It's a shock. But I don't feel it very much, really. I don't feel any different. We've all got to die, and it doesn't seem to make any great difference, anyhow, whether you die or not. I can't feel any grief, you know. It leaves me cold. I can't quite account for it. You don't care if you die or not? Asked Birkin. Gerald looked at him with eyes blue as the blue-fibered steel of a weapon. He felt awkward but indifferent. As a matter of fact, he did care terribly, with a great fear. Oh, he said, I don't want to die, why should I? But I never trouble. The question doesn't seem to be on the carpet for me at all. It doesn't interest me, you know. Timor mortis conturbit me, quoted Birkin, adding, no, death doesn't really seem the point anymore. It curiously doesn't concern one. It's like an ordinary tomorrow. Gerald looked closely at his friend. The eyes of the two men met, and an unspoken understanding was exchanged. Gerald narrowed his eyes. His face was cool and unscrupulous as he looked at Birkin, impersonally, with a vision that ended in a point in space, strangely keen-eyed and yet blind. If death isn't the point, he said, in a strangely abstract, cold, fine voice, what is? He sounded as if he had been found out. What is? Re-echoed Birkin. And there was a mocking silence. There's a long way to go, after the point of intrinsic death, before we disappear, said Birkin. There is, said Gerald. But what sort of way? He seemed to press the other man for knowledge, which he himself knew far better than Birkin did. Right down the slopes of degeneration. Mystic, universal degeneration. There are many stages of pure degradation to go through, age-long. We live on long after our death, and progressively, in progressive devolution. Gerald listened with a faint, fine smile on his face, all the time, as if, somewhere, he knew so much better than Birkin all about this, as if his own knowledge were direct and personal, whereas Birkin's was a matter of observation and inference, not quite hitting the nail on the head, though aiming near enough at it. But he was not going to give himself away. If Birkin could get at the secrets, let him. Gerald would never help him. Gerald would be a dark horse to the end. Of course, he said, with a startling change of conversation. It is father who really feels it. It will finish him. For him, the world collapses. All his care now is for Winnie. He must save Winnie. He says she ought to be sent away to school, but she won't hear of it, and he'll never do it. Of course, she is in rather a queer way. We're all of us curiously bad at living. We can do things, but we can't get on with life at all. It's curious, a family failing. She oughtn't to be sent away to school, said Birkin, who was considering a new proposition.
She oughtn't.
Why? She's a queer child, a special child, more special even than you. And in my opinion, special children should never be sent away to school. Only moderately ordinary children should be sent to school, so it seems to me. I'm inclined to think just the opposite. I think it would probably make her more normal if she went away and mixed with other children. She wouldn't mix, you see. You never really mixed, did you? And she wouldn't be willing even to pretend to. She's proud and solitary and naturally apart. If she has a single nature, why do you want to make her gregarious? No, I don't want to make her anything, but I think school would be good for her. Was it good for you? Gerald's eyes narrowed uglily.
School had been torture to him.
Yet he had not questioned whether one should go through this torture. He seemed to believe in education through subjection and torment. I hated it at the time, but I can see it was necessary, he said. It brought me into line a bit, and you can't live unless you do come into line somewhere. Well, said Birkin, I begin to think that you can't live unless you keep entirely out of the line. It's no good trying to toe the line when your one impulse is to smash up the line. Winnie is a special nature, and for special natures you must give a special world. Yes, but where's your special world, said Gerald. Make it. Instead of chopping yourself down to fit the world, chop the world down to fit yourself. As a matter of fact, two exceptional people make another world. You and I, we make another separate world. You don't want a world same as your brothers-in-law. It's just the special quality you value. Do you want to be normal or ordinary? It's a lie. You want to be free and extraordinary in an extraordinary world of liberty. Gerald looked at Birkin with subtle eyes of knowledge, but he would never openly admit what he felt. He knew more than Birkin in one direction, much more, and this gave him his gentle love for the other man, as if Birkin were in some way young, innocent, childlike, so amazingly clever, but incurably innocent. Yet you are so banal as to consider me chiefly a freak, said Birkin pointedly. A freak, exclaimed Gerald, startled, and his face opened suddenly, as if lighted with simplicity, as when a flower opens out of the cunning bud. No, I never consider you a freak. And he watched the other man with strange eyes that Birkin could not understand. I feel, Gerald continued, that there is always an element of uncertainty about you. Perhaps you are uncertain about yourself, but I'm never sure of you. You can go away and change as easily as if you had no soul. He looked at Birkin with penetrating eyes. Birkin was amazed. He thought he had all the soul in the world. He stared in amazement, and Gerald, watching, saw the amazing, attractive goodliness of his eyes, a young, spontaneous goodness that attracted the other man infinitely, yet filled him with bitter chagrin, because he mistrusted it so much. He knew Birkin could do without him, could forget and not suffer. This was always present in Gerald's consciousness, filling him with bitter unbelief. This consciousness of the young, animal-like spontaneity of detachment. It seemed almost like hypocrisy and lying sometimes, often on Birkin's part, to talk so deeply and importantly. Quite other things were going through Birkin's mind. Suddenly, he saw himself confronted with another problem, the problem of love and eternal conjunction between two men. Of course this was necessary. It had been a necessity inside himself all his life, to love a man purely and fully. Of course he had been loving Gerald all along, and all along denying it. He lay in the bed and wondered, whilst his friend sat beside him, lost in brooding. Each man was gone in his own thoughts. You know how the old German knights used to swear a Blutbruderschaft, he said to Gerald, with quite a new happy activity in his eyes. Make a little wound in their arms and rub each other's blood into the cut, said Gerald. Yes, and swear to be true to each other, of one blood, all their lives. That is what we ought to do. No wounds, that is obsolete. But we ought to swear to love each other, you and I, implicitly and perfectly, finally, without any possibility of going back on it. He looked at Gerald with clear, happy eyes of discovery. Gerald looked down at him, attracted, so deeply bondaged in fascinated attraction, that he was mistrustful, resenting the bondage, hating the attraction. "We will swear to each other one day, shall we?" pleaded Birkin. "We will swear to stand by each other, be true to each other, ultimately, infallibly, given to each other organically, without possibility of taking back." Birkin sought hard to express himself, but Gerald hardly listened. His face shone with a certain luminous pleasure.
He was pleased.
But he kept his reserve. He held himself back. "Shall we swear to each other one day?" said Birkin, putting out his hand towards Gerald. Gerald just touched the extended fine, living hand, as if withheld and afraid. "We'll leave it till I understand it better," he said, in a voice of excuse. Birkin watched him. A little sharp disappointment, perhaps a touch of contempt came into his heart. "Yes," he said. "You must tell me what you think later. You know what I mean? Not sloppy emotionalism. An impersonal union that leaves one free." They lapsed both into silence. Birkin was looking at Gerald all the time. He seemed now to see, not the physical, animal man, which he usually saw in Gerald, and which usually he liked so much, but the man himself, complete and as if fated, doomed, limited. This strange sense of fatality in Gerald, as if he were limited to one form of existence, one knowledge, one activity, a sort of fatal halfness, which to himself seemed wholeness, always overcame Birkin after their moments of passionate approach and filled him with a sort of contempt or boredom. It was the insistence on the limitation which so bored Birkin and Gerald. Gerald could never fly away from himself, in real indifferent gaiety. He had a clog, a sort of monomania. There was silence for a time. Then Birkin said, in a lighter tone, letting the stress of the contact pass, "Can't you get a good governess for Winifred? Somebody exceptional?" Hermione Rawdice suggested we should ask Gudrun to teach her to draw and to model in clay. "You know, Winnie is astonishingly clever with that plasticine stuff." Hermione declares she is an artist. Gerald spoke in the usual animated, chatty manner, as if nothing unusual had passed. But Birkin's manner was full of reminder. "Really? I didn't know that." "Oh, well then, if Gudrun would teach her, it would be perfect. Couldn't be anything better if Winifred is an artist. Because Gudrun somewhere is one. And every true artist is the salvation of every other." I thought they got on so badly as a rule. Perhaps. But only artists produce for each other the world that is fit to live in. If you can arrange that for Winifred, it is perfect. But you think she wouldn't come? I don't know. Gudrun is rather self-opinionated. She won't go cheap anywhere. Or if she does, she'll pretty soon take herself back. So whether she would condescend to do private teaching, particularly here in Beldover, I don't know. But it would be just the thing. Winifred has got a special nature. And if you can put into her way the means of being self-sufficient, that is the best thing possible. She'll never get on with the ordinary life. You find it difficult enough yourself, and she is several skins thinner than you are. It is awful to think what her life will be like unless she does find a means of expression, some way of fulfillment. You can see what mere leaving it to fate brings. You can see how much marriage is to be trusted to. Look at your own mother. Do you think Mother is abnormal?
No.
I think she only wanted something more or other than the common run of life. And not getting it, she has gone wrong perhaps. After producing a brood of wrong children, said Gerald gloomily. No more wrong than any of the rest of us, Birkin replied. The most normal people have the worst subterranean selves. Take them one by one. Sometimes I think it is a curse to be alive, said Gerald with sudden impotent anger. Well, said Birkin, why not? Let it be a curse sometimes to be alive. At other times it is anything but a curse. You've got plenty of zest in it, really. Less than you'd think, said Gerald, revealing a strange poverty in his look at the other man. There was silence, each thinking his own thoughts. I don't see what she has to distinguish between teaching at the grammar school and coming to teach when, said Gerald. The difference between a public servant and a private one. The only nobleman today, king and only aristocrat, is the public, the public. You are quite willing to serve the public, but to be a private tutor. I don't want to serve either.
No.
And Gudrun will probably feel the same. Gerald thought for a few minutes. Then he said, at all events, Father won't make her feel like a private servant. He will be fussy and grateful enough.
So he ought.
And so ought all of you. Do you think you can hire a woman like Gudrun Brangwen with money? She is your equal like anything, probably your superior. Is she? Said Gerald. Yes, and if you haven't the guts to know it, I hope she'll leave you to your own devices. Nevertheless, said Gerald, if she's my equal, I wish she weren't a teacher, because I don't think teachers as a rule are my equal. Nor do I, damn them. But am I a teacher because I teach, or a parson because I preach? Gerald laughed. He was always uneasy on this score. He did not want to claim social superiority, yet he would not claim intrinsic personal superiority, because he would never base his standard of values on pure being. So he wobbled upon a tacit assumption of social standing. No, Birkin wanted him to accept the fact of intrinsic difference between human beings, which he did not intend to accept. It was against his social honor, his principle. He rose to go. I've been neglecting my business all this while, he said, smiling. I ought to have reminded you before, Birkin replied, laughing and mocking. I knew you'd say something like that, laughed Gerald, rather uneasily. Did you? Yes, Rupert. It wouldn't do for us all to be like you are. We should soon be in a cart. When I am above the world, I shall ignore all businesses. Of course, we're not in the cart now, said Birkin satirically. Not as much as you make out. At any rate, we have enough to eat and drink. And be satisfied, added Birkin. Gerald came near the bed and stood looking down at Birkin, whose throat was exposed, whose tossed hair fell attractively on the warm brow, above the eyes that were so unchallenged and still in the satirical face. Gerald, full-limbed and turgid with energy, stood unwilling to go. He was held by the presence of the other man. He had not the power to go away. So, said Birkin, goodbye. And he reached out his hand from under the bedclothes, smiling with a glimmering look. Goodbye, said Gerald, taking the warm hand of his friend in a firm grasp. I shall come again. I miss you down at the mill. I'll be there in a few days, said Birkin. The eyes of the two men met again. Gerald's, that were keen as a hawk's, were suffused now with warm light and with unadmitted love. Birkin looked back as out of a darkness, unsound and unknown, yet with a kind of warmth that seemed to flow over Gerald's brain like a fertile sleep. Goodbye then. There's nothing I can do for you. Nothing, thanks. Birkin watched the black-clothed form of the other man move out of the door. The bright head was gone. He turned over to sleep. 17. The industrial magnate. In Beldover, there was both for Ursula and for Gudrun an interval. It seemed to Ursula as if Birkin had gone out of her for the time. He had lost his significance. He scarcely mattered in her world. She had her own friends, her own activities, her own life. She turned back to the old ways with zest, away from him. And Gudrun, after feeling every moment in all her veins conscious of Gerald Critch, connected even physically with him, was now almost indifferent to the thought of him. She was nursing new schemes for going away and trying a new form of life. All the time, there was something in her urging her to avoid the final establishing of a relationship with Gerald. She felt it would be wiser and better to have no more than a casual acquaintance with him. She had a scheme for going to St. Petersburg, where she had a friend who was a sculptor like herself and who lived with a wealthy Russian whose hobby was jewel making. The emotional, rather rootless life of the Russians appealed to her. She did not want to go to Paris. Paris was dry and essentially boring. She would like to go to Rome, Munich, Vienna, or to St. Petersburg or Moscow. She had a friend in St. Petersburg and a friend in Munich. To each of these she wrote, asking about rooms. She had a certain amount of money. She had come home partly to save, and now she had sold several pieces of work. She had been praised in various shows. She knew she could become quite the go if she went to London. But she knew London. She wanted something else. She had 70 pounds, of which nobody knew anything. She would move soon as she heard from her friends. Her nature, in spite of her apparent placidity and calm, was profoundly restless. The sisters happened to call in a cottage in Wiley Green to buy honey. Mrs. Kirk, a stout, pale, sharp-nosed woman, sly, honeyed, with something shrewish and cat-like beneath, asked the girls into her too cozy, too tidy kitchen. There was a cat-like comfort and cleanliness everywhere. "Yes, Miss Brangwen," she said, in her slightly whining, insinuating voice. "And how do you like being back in the old place, then?" Gudrun, whom she addressed, hated her at once. "I don't care for it," she replied abruptly. "You don't? I suppose you found a difference from London. You like life and big, grand places. Some of us has to be content with Wiley Green and Beldover. And what do you think of our grammar school, as there's so much talk about?" "What do I think of it?" Gudrun looked round at her slowly. "Do you mean, do I think it's a good school?"
Yes.
"What is your opinion of it?" "I do think it's a good school." Gudrun was very cold and repelling. She knew the common people hated the school. You do then. I've heard so much, one way and the other. It's nice to know what those that's in it feel. But opinions vary, don't they? Mr. Critchup at Highclose is all for it. Poor man. I'm afraid he's not long for this world. He's very poorly." "Is he worse?" asked Ursula. Yes, since they lost Miss Diana. He's gone off to a shadow. Poor man. He's had a world of trouble." "Has he?" asked Gudrun, faintly ironic. "He has a world of trouble. And as nice and kind a gentleman as ever you could wish to meet. His children don't take after him." "I suppose they take after their mother," said Ursula. "In many ways." Mrs. Crick lowered her voice a little. She was a proud, haughty lady when she came into these parts. My word, she was that. She mustn't be looked at, and it was worth your life to speak to her. The woman made a dry, sly face. "Did you know her when she was first married?" "Yes, I knew her. I nursed 3 of her children. And proper little terrors, they were little fiends. That Gerald was a demon, if ever there was one, a proper demon, at 6 months old." A curious, malicious, sly tone came into the woman's voice. "Really," said Gudrun. "That willful, masterful. He'd mastered one nurse at 6 months. Kick and scream and struggle like a demon. Many's the time I've pinched his little bottom for him when he was a child in arms. And he'd have been better if he'd had it pinched oftener. But she wouldn't have them corrected. No, wouldn't hear of it. I can remember the rows she had with Mr. Critch, my word. When he got worked up, properly worked up till he could stand no more, he'd lock the study door and whip them. But she paced up and down all the while like a tiger outside, like a tiger, with very murder in her face. She had a face that could look death. And when the door was opened, she'd go in with her hands lifted. "What have you been doing to my children, you coward?" She was like one out of her mind. I believe he was frightened of her. He had to be driven mad before he'd lift a finger. Didn't the servants have a life of it? And didn't we used to be thankful when one of them caught it? They were the torment of your life. "Really," said Gudrun, "in every possible way. If you wouldn't let them smash their pots on the table, if you wouldn't let them drag the kitten about with a string round its neck, if you wouldn't give them whatever they asked for, every mortal thing, then there was a shine on, and their mother coming and asking, 'What's the matter with him? What have you done to him? What is it, darling?' And then she'd turn on you, as if she'd trample you under her feet. But she didn't trample on me. I was the only one that could do anything with her demons, for she wasn't going to be bothered with them herself. No, she took no trouble for them. But they must just have their way. They mustn't be spoken to. And Master Gerald was the beauty. I left when he was 1.5 years. I could stand no more. But I pinched his little bottom for him when he was in arms. I did, when there was no holding him, and I'm not sorry I did." Gudrun went away in fury and loathing. The phrase, "I pinched his little bottom for him," sent her into a white, stony fury. She could not bear it. She wanted to have the woman taken out at once and strangled. And yet there the phrase was lodged in her mind forever, beyond escape. She felt, one day, she would have to tell him, to see how he took it. And she loathed herself for the thought. But at Shortlands the lifelong struggle was coming to a close. The father was ill and was going to die. He had bad internal pains, which took away all his attentive life, and left him with only a vestige of his consciousness. More and more silence came over him. He was less and less acutely aware of his surroundings. The pain seemed to absorb his activity. He knew it was there. He knew it would come again. It was like something lurking in the darkness within him, and he had not the power or the will to seek it out and to know it. There it remained in the darkness, the great pain, tearing him at times, and then being silent.